Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And I guess the question is, do you think movements like Black Lives Matter and the Occupy movement and some of these other movements that you mentioned, and maybe it's different in America than, say, Podemos and Syriza, but do they pose the same threat to the system that some of the resistance movements posed in the first Gilded Age?
They pose a new beginning.
Okay.
They pose a new beginning. We live in a very different set of political and social formations, and economic formations, and so the question is unfair to me. I mean, I understand it, but I think that unless you contextualize that historically, it doesn't mean much. But I actually think that in this particular historical moment, there are possibilities for struggles that could actually come together and change the nature of how we understand politics. I absolutely believe that, and I want to believe that. And I think not to believe that is to place ourselves in a position where we become either cynical or become complicit.
Well, okay, so I want to go here now too, because you've spoken about the fact that, as you say, idiocy dominates our culture, and you've quoted Rick Santorum as saying something like the last thing the Republican Party needs now is intellectuals. So here's a question: aside from how did we come to this place to so devalue education, intelligence, and literacy in our culture? But the question in my mind, and this is a difficult one, if we really believe in democracy, are we prepared to live with the outcome of a fully democratic say in the system right now when the population has been so sort of removed from the process of engaging these issues and thinking about these issues critically? I mean, there are what to some people would be considered some scary opinions and directions that they would like the country to move in. So no, it's a great question. I think there are a number of answers to that, and I think the first answer is that, look, democracy is messy. It's messy, and what I mean by that is that it's not so smooth that we have to assume that any struggle for it is not going to be a struggle that's ongoing among contesting elements. That's for sure. But secondly, I think that that's actually central to what the struggle for democracy is about, which is to realize that there are a number of groups in the country that are unbelievably ignorant, stupid, civically illiterate, and believe the crap that comes out of Fox News, which is the new Pravda of America, right? And I think that's the beginning of the struggle. That's not the end of the struggle. I mean, that's something that anybody who takes democracy seriously is going to have to address. I mean, what does it mean now to engage in forms of cultural, political, and educational struggles in which the ideologies that dominate these groups have to be challenged? I mean, how do we get people to understand the connections between, for instance, the attack on public schools and the attack on the social state? How do we get people to understand that what's happening around capitalism and its drive for progress and resources is really a death wish for the planet? And so it seems to me, how do we begin to understand what agency is? I mean, how do we talk about the crisis of agency in this day and age within this new historical formation? And what challenges does that pose? And certainly one of those challenges is exactly what you've said, that all of a sudden since the 1920s, we've lived in the age of the anti-Enlightenment. I mean, we're in the midst of a counter-revolution. And that counter-revolution is not just driven by economics, it's also driven by ideology. And those ideologies have to be taken up and they have to be challenged in a very powerful way. We see, Eric, we actually see some of this happening, right? I mean, in Seattle, you have teachers and parents who are saying, look, we're not doing this testing anymore. We're done. And they're challenging it. We see, I mean, in Ferguson, the tragedy in Ferguson was not, unfortunately, this terrible murder or killing that took place. The great tragedy was you had 95% of the population being shaken down by the police. And all of a sudden, 95% of them, they're all going to court, to jail over traffic violations, right? Because they're a source of revenue. And I think this kind of widespread militarization and this criminalization of behaviors that have taken place have given rise to something we're starting to recognize, and that is that as the social state is eliminated, what takes its place is the punishing state. And the punishing state is now becoming more intensified. And I think that that's one way of people beginning to organize and to bring groups together in recognizing that at the heart of the system is a systemic form of violence against most people. Gosh, I hope you're right, Henry. I mean, just to take one example, The Guardian recently has done some fantastic reporting about the sort of the police state's manifestation in Chicago, right? And there's this black site, Homan Square in Chicago, where people are arrested, they're not booked, they're detained indefinitely, they can't be found by lawyers, family, they're potentially held against their will. Yeah, they're disappeared within the borders of this country.
Right.
And I feel like in the national media, there's virtually no attention paid to it. No one's outraged by this. There seems to be this perception that, well, when it happens here, it's okay. If this happened in another country, that we would, that's outrageous. But when it happens here, it's okay because it's us. But I don't understand how people.
Let me try
jump
to
in. Go
respond
ahead.
to that in a way that captures your frustration and my sense of frustration as well, but also my sense of hope. I was just in Chicago this week, and I gave 3 talks at the American Educational Research Association, which is the largest educational institution in the organization in the United States. And I met an enormous number of young minority people and young people who were so fired up. I mean, I've never seen anything like it. Mm-hmm. And this is exactly what they talk about. They talk about the militarization. They talk about the war on youth. They talk about the need for a new political party, a new political formation. Every session I was at that I had to speak at, it was overflowing. And I see this everywhere I go. I mean, there is such a hunger for a new language, for new modes of analysis, that even in the midst of such despair, such outrageous fascism and systemic violence, all of a sudden these are not... What gives me hope, and maybe I'm terribly wrong, is for the first time in 20 years, I see people connecting the dots. Mm-hmm. So that when they look at what happened in Chicago, there's a sense that there's a broader political issue at stake here, and not just in the United States. I mean, as you know, in my work, I'm talking about the politics of disposability, the politics of disappearance. And I'm connecting it, to everything from the Argentinian repression in the 1970s, of course, to what happened in Chile, because we need to do that. We need to recognize that authoritarianism didn't die in Nazi Germany and of course, the Soviet Union and in fascist Italy. Mm-hmm. That all of a sudden it's making a comeback. And I think people are realizing that their lives are truly in jeopardy, that all the institutions that matter in a democracy are being eviscerated. And I think there's where we have to sort of in some way put our hope. I mean, I really do think that young people today are on a different mindset. Those kids in the working class who are just surviving because the politics. I mean, the war on young people today is about eliminating the radical imagination, putting them in debt, putting them in schools that don't matter, that are terrible, putting them in jail, and trying to simply destroy this generation in a way like we've never seen before. I mean, the war on young people is a generational issue. It's not just a class issue. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's been such a response to that on the part of young people. They realize they've been written out of democracy. And I think we're seeing something happening in the country, and we'll see more of it, that will actually link up with other international movements, and I'm hoping that something will come of this. And that, there will be further struggles, more direct action, more nonviolent activity, and more attempts to sort of educate people about their responsibility to future generations, if not their own lives.
I'll give you a couple examples. I'm a teacher in a local public high school.
Right.
I teach special education, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this. After the Ferguson incident, where Michael Brown was killed by Officer Darren Wilson, I obviously, like many people, was disgusted, repulsed by this incident, and I felt sort of helpless, but I wanted to do something, and I felt like it was an important teachable moment for the youth in America to have these difficult conversations. So I offered to administration to lead some discussion groups after school, which is a little bit outside my purview because I'm a special education teacher. But I thought it was important, and it would be after school and free from credits or whatever. But we would discuss and debate these issues and really kind of burrow down into them. And I made what I felt to be a perfectly reasonable diplomatic proposal to do this, and it was met with silence from administration. They made no response whatsoever, which to me was just bespeaks the cowardice that is sort of rampant in our public education system in America right now.
No, I'm with you. I think that the war on education hasn't been won, but it's close to having been won by the right. And I think the assault has been so overwhelming since the Powell memo of the 1970s, in which they said kids were not being indoctrinated enough in the lessons of free enterprise. And then they created their own public intellectuals, of course, their own conservative foundations to be able to address this. That war has been relentless. And I think one of the great and tragic things is that so many educators have bought into this, administrators. Not only at the public school level, but as you know, also around the corporatization of higher education. And I was a high school teacher, Eric, for 6 years. I'm not sure if you know that.
I didn't know.
So I know where you are, and I know what that's like. But I also know that I've met. I mean, God, the number of high school teachers and public school teachers that I meet who are really on fire. Because they realize that they're losing their autonomy, that schools are becoming testing machines, that they're marked by pedagogies of oppression and not pedagogies of hope and possibility. And I think that one of the great struggles in this country is taking them back. And I think people are starting to realize how far, when you talk about testing 5-year-olds, right? Or you talk about putting handcuffs on kids and putting police in schools, and putting more administrators in higher education than actually faculty, and having 70% of all higher education faculty on being adjuncts. I mean, clearly there's a war against public and higher education, right? So that that encounter you had, that kind of enormous indifference, is not really just about a good idea being killed, or a really important civic idea being killed. It's also about it's symptomatic of a larger attack and war. That's what it really is, and that's how it should be talked about.
Right. Well, and so what about this notion that, the University of Southern Maine system is going through this right now, this idea that higher education, public universities, need to be run like a business, and
it's just pure, unadulterated financial fascism. That's all it is. I mean, what this is really about is it's about consolidating class and corporate power in ways to completely eviscerate the power of faculty and to reconfigure the university not as a public good, but simply as a business culture. As something that simply operates in the interest of capital. What we're seeing here is a neoliberal model designed to reduce labor costs and increase labor civility. That's really what we're seeing. What we're seeing is a university that's being divested of any sense of what it means to educate people to be critically engaged, to be smart, to take civic responsibility seriously. These have now become disimagination machines. That's what they are. They're disimagination machines. They're not about educating people to be agents. They're about expanding administrative layers of bureaucracy. They're basically, as you know. But I also think that what we need to recognize, they're about eviscerating the curriculum, turning it basically into a training curriculum. I don't know if you know this, but Rick Scott in Florida actually proposed that tuition rates would be higher for kids who went into the liberal arts and lower for kids who went into fields of study that entirely benefited business. Can you imagine?
I'm not surprised. I'm sorry to say.
And of course, putting kids in debt and so forth and so on, as I said earlier, while you have, this is unimaginable in places like Finland, Germany, and Mexico, where you really have free education. It's free. Actually, higher education and public education should be free, and of the highest quality. But what the University of Southern Maine, a place I actually graduated from when I was a kid, what is going through is what a lot of other universities are going through, and this is basically the neoliberalization and corporatization of the university. Studies are coming out now saying that that the administrative faculty outnumber and staff outnumber faculty now. So that'll give you a sense of what this is about. This is really about the takeover of higher education in the interest of corporate America. That's what this is about. It has nothing to do with the long-standing idealistic assumption that higher education is a public good.
So help us understand, Henry, if schools and universities should not be simply producing productive and successful workers for the marketplace. If that's not their sole purpose, what is it that they should be doing? What are we missing in contemporary education?
I mean, I think that there are a number of things. I think that, first of all, we need to go on the defensive in defending public and higher education as a public good in order to reclaim its egalitarian and democratic impulses. That's the first thing. We need a sustained critique of what has happened to public and higher education and how it's been transformed from a public good into an alleged private right, into a private entitlement, and how under that argument it basically serves economic interests. Secondly, it seems to me we need to provide free access to higher education. Higher and public education should be free. We can educate every kid in the United States for $62 billion a year. That's like nothing compared to what the military budget is. I mean, you have a plane in this country called the F-35 stealth jet. They cost $400 million a piece. The United States is producing them at the cost of $1 trillion. $1 trillion. So it isn't as if we don't have the money. It's a question of how we reconfigure that money in ways in which we pump it into those areas that matter. Fourthly, I mean, educating kids, even in their language, is a great investment. I mean, societies that have educated populations tend to be more democratic. They tend to be more healthy. There tends to be less crime. We know all that. So it seems to me to talk about higher education in a way that benefits the entire society is very different than saying our kids should be educated and get credentials. They should be able to just simply get good jobs. I mean, we need to think of higher education and public education as a public good that basically benefits everyone, from the individual kids and students to basically the society at large. To carry this, to go even further, power has to be given back to teachers. I mean, we have completely eviscerated teachers from any possibility of holding power and having any influence over the conditions of their labor anymore. It just doesn't exist. I mean, people like, when I was in high school and I was a teacher, I mean, we elected people to decide who would be the principals. I mean, we taught I taught courses on alienation, right? We didn't have standardized objectives. We didn't do that stuff. We didn't have police in the schools. I mean, the police have got to be removed from the schools. I mean, we have to talk about places in which kids learn, not places where they're under surveillance. Not places where they're taught constantly that they're basically more of a threat than a social investment. We have to reconfigure the relationship between education and young people. I mean, what's education for? It's not to turn them into robots, who can't think, who unquestionably accept any notion of authority. It's to actually train them and educate them in ways in which they question authority, in which they learn how to govern and not simply be governed. So that conversation has to change entirely.
That was the other example I was going to give about the sort of militarization of schools. We have a school resource officer in our school, and it's a relatively small rural area, so there's one officer, but he recently sent out an email saying, hey, so just so you know, I'm going to be looking a little bit different. There's some uniform changes, and it might look a little aggressive, but it's really to help my back and all this stuff. But the change is that he's wearing a military-style vest with his weapons externally sort of placed on the vest. It looks very aggressive, very much.
No, I mean, it's such a symptomatic and horrible indication of the evisceration of democracy and the institutions for which matter for that democracy. I mean, when you organize institutions such as schools around the question around a culture of fear, when you militarize every relationship in the school, from the way in which we treat kids and arrest them, to criminalizing their behavior, to pulling them out of schools in handcuffs, when you put handcuffs on 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, I mean, because they cause a temper tantrum, or because they're doodling on a desk, or because they're throwing peanuts at a bus, as the head of the Rutherford Foundation John Rutherford has completely reminded us. You really have something happening that is the antithesis of what should be going on in schools. Schools are not places where kids should be punished. They're places where we should make investments in young people and in their future. And I think the militarization of American society is nowhere more evident. Actually, it's not true. It's certainly more evident the fact that we're incarcerating more people than ever before. Mm-hmm. But I think that what we've never seen before is a school system that's now modeled after the prison. I mean, which is indicative of something that I call punishment creep, right? Mm-hmm. Meaning that the punishing state now is no longer invested in very narrowly defined, isolated institutions such as the prison. I mean, the models, the values that that mark those institutions now have come to characterize a whole range of institutions, including schools.
I also wanted to ask you, while we're on the topic of education, there's this sweeping movement towards the Common Core standards across the country, sort of led by Bill Gates, who is sort of behind a lot of this, and his money is sort of behind a lot of this. So here's my question to you about this. Okay, I think a lot of people, can understand the stated intent behind it, which is to say that across the board, we want to make sure that a fifth grade education is sort of an equal standard in Maine as it is, say, in California, that the children are learning, at the same pace and progressing at the same pace. I think people can understand that, right? So what is the alternative to having sort of standards like that sort of make sure that students are receiving quality education at the same rates as students around the country?
The first thing we need to do is reject the notion that standards equal standardization. Mm-hmm. I mean, and maybe we can begin there. Okay. And that, to have standards that matter is not the same as testing kids to death or completely turning the curriculum over to corporate interests who are making billions of dollars on administering these tests and producing them. Mm-hmm. I mean, maybe the best thing to do is to look at other countries that actually do this, and in ways that matter. And if you look at a country like everybody has, but nobody really wants to talk about adequately, is Finland. And what do you find? You find that teachers are paid as much, if not more, than doctors and lawyers. They have an enormous amount of legitimacy, and they all get a free education, and they get that education using very rigorous standards, intellectual standards. They all have to have master's degrees. There's 2 people in the classroom. The classrooms are small, and they make sure that these kids are learning in ways in which that matters. And then they're comparing these results across the country and trying to find out what works without imposing on every school a kind of standardizing model that ignores context and ignores the ability of teachers to be autonomous and to exercise some degree of imagination within the context in which they find themselves in order to make school meaningful, in order to make it critical and transformative. I mean, these models are out there. It's not like they're invisible, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that even Diane Ravitch, who flipped from being a right winger to now a kind of left liberal, has recognized that. And I think now is the time to publicize. If we're really going to talk about quality education, then let's be serious. Let's talk about what kind of economic foundation is necessary for that, and then get away with the inequitous tax systems that benefit rich communities over poor communities. Let's talk about giving teachers a free education and giving them the best education possible and making sure they all have master's degree. Let's talk about making classrooms smaller. Let's talk about changing the curriculums of higher education so that all kids are inducted into, the sciences and the literary traditions that we think are enormously valuable. And then seeing how people work out those modes of teaching and evaluation in different ways, but are able to sustain a certain level of quality in which we know that kids are really being educated. I mean, this crap that, standardization is the ultimate measure of understanding that what kids are learning in the 5th grade all across the country at the same time. I mean, it sounds like a prescription for idiocy. But what it really is, and I don't mean to be hyperbolic, but what it really is a prescription for repression. Mm. That's what it really is. I mean, we need to go back to Paulo Freire. We need to go back to Dewey. We need to go back to George Counts. We need to go back to people who really took education seriously in that sense, and linked it to democracy and linked it to a very different mission. You can talk about standardization. These people can talk about standardization, but until they talk about what kind of vision really drives education, they have no right to say anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And so moving forward, okay, we're running out of time here. We've got about five minutes or so. I would like to ask you, so we have these pockets of resistance, sort of these shoots of hope kind of coming up around the country. The 15 Now movement,
right.
There's Kshama Sawant, who was elected as to the city council in Seattle.
Yeah.
There have even been, sort of like, Rahm Emanuel, right, is the corporate Democrat in Chicago, and he won.
He's a Wall Street Democrat.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
So he won his re-election, but he was challenged, and it was not a cakewalk. You had Bill de Blasio elected in New York. So we're seeing some things. It does seem to feel like there is something big brewing here. Something is coming, and it makes me wonder about the upcoming presidential election. We already see sort of the modes of debate being slammed shut. Right?
Right.
And so my question to you is, how much should we here on the bottom, looking up at this juggernaut sort of taking off without us, how much should we attend to that and sort of try and throw some wrenches into the gears? What does that mean? What does that look like? And if we shouldn't, then what should we be focused on instead?
That's a fabulous question. God. You're taxing my intelligence here. Let's begin this way. I think that the first thing we need to recognize is that elections are not the measure of democracy, and that they've been bought and sold. They're fraudulent. So I think to invest in this election by claiming that this is going to make a difference is simply nonsense. I think that what we really need to do at the local level, if there are elections at the local level in which we can make a difference by electing people like as in Seattle, right? Mm-hmm. People who on the left, progressives who really can change people's lives immediately in these kind of metropolitan centers of the small cities. We need to do that. The issue is not to drop out here, but the issue is not to call for. The issue is not simply about reformism. At one level, I think we need to do that. We need to put up alternative candidates. We need to use those elections as opportunities to educate people. But I think in the final analysis, Eric, honestly, we need a third party. We need a new political social formation. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but I think we need to talk about this. These parties are corrupt. They're corrupt. The major parties are corrupt. There is nothing to learn from them except that they are in the hands of lobbyists.
So,
I think if we can get that message across, and we can at one level have one foot in the system around questions of electing electoral representatives who in some way will be able to ward off at the very least the worst of the policies these neoliberals are imposing on us, that would be a small victory. We need to get people health care, right? Mm-hmm. We need to eliminate poverty. We need to do something in school boards about not turning them over to the right wingers who want to claim the world is flat. After that, the system has to be changed. I don't want to sound overly dramatic, but the system is broken, and it's in the hands of an authoritarian political system and culture. That's got to be changed. We have to be able to think beyond the horizons here. Mm-hmm. And we need a new political system. We need new political parties that do not operate under the aegis of corporate capitalism.
So I would be remiss. We have, if I didn't ask you this, now that you've raised this question, okay, so here in Portland, Maine, we have a fairly decent representation of the Green Party.
Right.
And so is this a viable third? Because obviously they have an apparatus. They are non-corporate. They have an apparatus that they've been working to build across the country. Dr. Jill Stein is a presumptive nominee, presidential nominee for 2016. Should we be rallying around an existing party such as the Green Party? Or should
I think the Green Party at a local level is fine. At a national level, we need something else. Mm-hmm. We need something that isn't just about ecology, that is about democracy. Is able to bring together a whole range of interest groups that basically have been fragmented and isolated. And I don't think the Green Party can do that. But that at the same time, I think that the Green Party can raise those issues in a very fundamental way just by virtue of the fact that they're an alternative party.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Henry A. Giroux, for being here on the Soapbox. It's been a pleasure to speak with you.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have been on the program.